Okay, so I just hit record so that I'm not forgetting that part. So today we are starting module 3, and we're going to focus on classroom connection and communication this week. My name is Emma Banks. I am the secondary digital learning and computer science specialist at the Department of Ed, and co-hosting with me is John, and I'm going to pass it off to him to introduce himself and get us going today.
Hi, everybody. I'm John Graham. I'm the elementary digital learning specialist. So here's kind of an overview for Module 3. So today we're going to be doing social emotional integration to enhance remote learning connections. Then you can see parts 2 and 3 of this week, which will be Wednesday and Thursday of this week.
Oops, wrong.
So the first one for today, we're going to be looking at social emotional learning today. So all kinds of stuff. First thing we're going to have to do is obviously define social emotional learning. We'll be using the acronym SEL. So if you hear that, that's what we're referring to. Then we're going to explore ways that you can bring it into your classroom very deliberately, with very specific activities in mind. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about integrating it into your classroom. So either of those approaches is fine. Probably some of both is probably the best method. So we'll be exploring both of those. So we have this nice graphic that Emma put together to kind of separate social emotional learning into those 5 quadrants that we're going to be looking at. So these 5 areas: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. Those are going to be the different ones that we're going to be looking at. And this, a lot of our kind of understanding of this is based off of Castle, which is cited there, kind of their definition of social emotional learning. So give folks just a second if you want to read that. And then we're going to go through these one by one. So we will start with self-awareness. So one of the ways that we were talking about, kind of thinking about each of these, is talking about what it looks like, how you're seeing people demonstrating each of these aspects, and then what are things that you might hear, questions, comments, stuff like that. So for self-awareness, a lot of it is confidence in a person's personal ability in something, recognizing their own emotions and behaviors, so thinking about themselves. And sounds like, so something like, where do I belong? So reflecting on one's place. And then what causes me stress? So thinking about what are those stressors that you have around you. So those are kind of some things about self-awareness. In terms of activities, so if you want to be incorporating self-awareness into your remote learning environment, here are a couple of suggestions. So for a self-reflective artifact, creating something, if you've used Flipgrid before, and I know we've done a couple of trainings and examples of sharing it over the past few weeks, Flipgrid, essentially, you have a prompt, students respond to that prompt with videos. So if you're doing if they're doing self-reflection, you can just ask them, a self-reflective question, and they can respond to that with a video. Or you can, and I've actually heard some really cool anecdotes of teachers have had students do all about me slideshows that they've shared with their peers, and peers could view them, make comments on them, or they maybe shared them in a video conference call. But what's nice about that is it allows students to, be thinking about themselves. You could have some specific elements that you might add in there that you want them to touch upon. So a nice self-reflective activity there that, trust me, many kids of all ages would love to do that. There are a lot of mindfulness podcasts out there, so you can see all of the items that you'll see on the slideshow that are underlined when we share this out. Those will all have links that you can go to. So I included a couple in there. Peace Out, Best Day Yet, Be Calm on Awe Island, and the Calm Kids podcast. They're actually, there's so many that are out there. Peace Out is one that I really like in particular. I think it's a nice calming podcast for people to listen to. So a nice thing to share, and it's very thematic in nature. So those could be things that you might share out with students to have an activity for them to do, or they're pieces that you could listen to in a physical classroom as well, or have a station. So there's a lot of flexibility there with that. And then the last one, emotional reflection. So emojis obviously are pervasive in our society now. So you can actually leverage something like emojis that you see in a lot of places, and you could actually talk with students, have them identify, what does this emoji mean? What do you think this emoji means? Or which of these emojis shows happiness? Or which of these ones shows anger or frustration? So it can be a nice mechanism for having some discussions about emotions. And then the last one that I linked to in there is actually an emoji bingo game. So if you were to say, instead of showing what the face looks like, if you said what the emotion was, and the kids had to match on the bingo board using the emojis on the board and just kind of their own thinking about what you say. If you said, all right, if you have a frustration emoji face, then that's 1 square. So that can be another kind of way to gamify that process as well. But emojis are out there, people love them, always get a response to them. So I think those are some fun activities to bring them into your classroom. Moving along to self-management. So that's going to look like practicing self-control, impulse control, things like that. Setting your own goals to achieve some sort of task, and then managing your own stress. So that might sound like somebody saying, I need a break, or asking for help, or things like that. So a couple examples. If you're hearing those, then that means maybe people are kind of going through a self-management process. So grounding yourself is very important. I did mention those podcasts in the last one. Sometimes if you're just listening to something, it can be difficult for students to really bring it in and focus, and sometimes sketchnoting can help with that. So there are a lot of podcasts out there that can provide some sort of background thinking, and as they're listening to those, they can do some doodling or drawing. So I think sometimes we might think that doodling is kind of a distraction, but for a lot of people, it's kind of a tool for helping them to focus their thoughts. So definitely sketch notes, and I have Kathy Schock's website on there I linked, has a ton of resources, both how to do it, how to get it started, roll out the concept to students and stuff like that. So that's a good resource if you're interested in sketch notes or sketchnoting. If you're in a virtual space with kids, and this is something that we talked about with engaging students in video conferencing, there are a lot of different games that you could play with students. Just to pick out one that I think is pretty common that people would know would be Simon Says, is something that you could do in a video conferencing space. So certainly something I think we think about doing in person. People are trying to think, what are those pieces that you can bring into a remote learning environment? How can you bring them into a video conference? And that's certainly something that you can say. So what I linked in there can give you some prompts to work through if you were doing a video conference version of Simon Says. So for students, especially younger students, that's good for them to be thinking about following directions and working your way through. And then the last one there, goal development is really important. This process obviously is going to look very different at the elementary level than it would look at the high school level, but I think using a SMART goal setting could be really helpful. So I think having that model, and there are lots of goal development models that are out there, but I think that's a really nice one that you could use. In terms of actually going through that process, I mean, that could look very different. You could, use some different tools for students to work through and do some goal development. And certainly could do parts and pieces of that in a video conferencing environment. So a couple activity suggestions there. Moving on to our next one is social awareness. So that's going to look like celebrating diversity. So different people, different groups, cultures, races, ethnicities around you, celebrating those, being empathetic towards other people, like thinking about how other people might feel. So it sounds like part of that. So what if I walked in their shoes? So getting students to be thinking about how another person's experience might be. And then what is that person thinking? So thinking about other people's thinking. And then some activities in there. Circle time, I know a lot of people did circle time, whether you're doing a synchronous model. So here's the time that I'm going to be available and everybody can get on and we can kind of do a circle time similar to what we did in a regular classroom or a regular, I shouldn't just say classroom because it's definitely, I have librarian suggestions. I know a lot of people do circle time outside of just like a regular mainstream classroom. But doing that circle time, if you're moving it into a virtual setting, there are definitely some ways that you can go about doing that, ways to mix it up. So you have a link to some suggestions from a librarian. So you could either do that in real time. So if you're doing, say, a Zoom session, you could go through and work through that process with students just as you would in a regular classroom, or you could actually pre-record that. And the benefit of pre-recording it is you could probably add a few more bells and whistles, maybe go back and do some editing and tweaking and pace yourself a little bit differently than if you're trying to do it with students at the same time. So just keep in mind something like circle time, even though we obviously do it in real time in a regular classroom, it is something that you could pre-record and share out with students. I think the key though is you want to keep it short, keep it kind of orderly and organized. So if your students have a structure that they're used to, try to honor that structure as much as you can, but try to mix it up as well. So it's not just sort of the same thing over and over again. So kind of finding that balance between what they've been doing and maybe doing something a little bit different. Community service is another great social awareness activity. I think an obvious one that you could certainly do right now that I have heard of some people doing is doing letter or card writing campaigns. So having some cause or having some group of people that you want to write to, you could do that. You also could do that, virtually. You could have kids write stuff and it could be shared virtually, or do recordings that way and then share those. Or you could, I didn't put that in here, but you could also make signs. I know we've seen a lot of signs around our communities thanking different people in our community. So something to be thinking about. And then the last one in there are diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, read alouds around those topics. So I did include a reading list in there from last summer. And what I liked about that one is it denoted the additions that they had to it. So if you're trying to find current read alouds to do with your students, certainly being mindful of thinking about the different audiences. And I think I love the idea of windows of, what is it? Windows, I'm spacing out what it is right now. Mirrors, windows, and is it screen doors or something like that? But that combination, I think that's a really nice concept that students, when they're reading books, they want to sometimes see themselves as in a mirror. Sometimes they want to see other people. You're kind of exposing them to other people in the world around them and kind of possibilities that exist out there. So I think it's nice to touch upon those different pieces to build their social awareness. Moving along to relationship skills. So I know this is something that people are feeling very anxious about during the, I don't want to say current situation, during the past 3 months. I think this was a big challenge for some people is how do you be mindful of students building relationships with one another? What are some ways that you can do that? So relationships obviously are working with other people, communicating with other people, doing that in a respectful way. So asking for clarification, or if you're disagreeing with somebody, kind of explaining why you disagree. or maybe rephrasing it if you feel like what you're saying isn't being heard or understood by the other party. So those are kind of some of those skills to be working on for relationship skills. In terms of some activities to be thinking about. So probably some of you have done a kind of friends bingo. I know I've done this certainly at staff meetings before, where you have a bingo card with some characteristics and you might go around amongst a group of people and you're trying to tick off, you know, if somebody has, I mean, it might be very physical characteristics, things that are very obvious, but it might be you have to get some discussion to kind of get pieces from people. So you could actually do that within a virtual setting where you have students, you know, go into different breakout rooms and try to figure out some of those parts and pieces. So I think that's a nice little game. And I know people are always trying to figure out what are different ways that I can leverage these breakout rooms when I get kids on a Zoom call. So that's kind of a way that you could do that. And I have some resources on there, either examples of bingo boards that you could use or generators if you want to make your own card. The fairy tale conflict resolution activity. Fairy tales, what I like about this is people tend to be very familiar with fairy tales. So you can kind of leverage that and look at a popular fairy tale like Goldilocks and the Three Bears and kind of work through that conflict resolution in that story. And I've linked a worksheet in there. So that can be something that's a little bit fun and different, and you're not needing to tell them a new story, although certainly you can kind of work that in as a read aloud or something like that. But that can be a nice way for students. And what's nice about this is you can do it at all levels. So obviously at a younger grade level, it's going to look very differently than it would at an older grade level. But I think don't have the assumption that just because it's a fairy tale, you know, middle school kids are going to turn their nose up at it. They're going to have a familiarity with the story or maybe their own version of the story. And maybe you can work as a group to kind of hash out some of the details of that story. So I think that's a nice activity to work through and be talking about how people work together and relate to one another, working through a situation. And then the last one, promote listening. So there's some nice activities in here that if you're kind of wondering what are some ways that I can get students to be listening better or kind of be more actively engaged, active listening. And there's some activities in there that you might consider looking at if you're trying to think of what are some ways that I can help students develop those skills. Certainly in a remote learning environment, if you have people that are accessing at different times, that makes it a little bit tricky. If you're having people come together in real time, I think especially like in a Zoom call, there are some things that you might talk about. You know, if your camera's turned off, how do I know that you're listening to me? How do I know that you're present? And obviously students could have their camera on and just be kind of doing other things. So I think it is a good time to have that conversation if you're going to be working in those modes. So that's just kind of some little activities there, but certainly something to be thinking about moving forward. Moving along. And responsible decision making. So our last one. So this is all about recognizing different problems, different scenarios, and then kind of talking through those problems, kind of reflecting on like the bottom part, if things are helpful, if they're impacting other people in a positive way, in a negative way. And students love to have these kinds of discussions. And I think as long as you find age-appropriate content, you can have some really cool discussions with students. So moving along. So the science behind class norming, so we kind of added that in there as a resource. I think developing class norms, and obviously we had a session earlier and talked all about class norms. That is a really important process, and students like being involved in that process as much as you can involve them. So I think in reflecting on what you might be doing for next year, or just, school time at any point, any involvement of students for whether it's, when we have a Zoom call, what makes sense? What are some protocols that we should be following? If I'm asking you guys to turn in work in Google Classroom, what are some realistic expectations for making all of that work? There's some great decision-making models out there. I included 2, PACE and Pooch. PACE I have used several times over the years, and it's a great model in terms of working through if you're making a decision, and you can open it up and make it something very, very focused that kids would be interested in, like purchasing something that they want or planning some sort of activity. And then they're weighing all the, pros and cons of different situations, different scenarios. So I think that is a really good model to work through, and is definitely something that in the remote learning setting is kind of a larger project that you could work through with students, that they would enjoy, get some of that voice and choice in there if they're having some say on what it is that they're trying to make a decision about. And then the last one, so we're actually going to be doing an activity for this last one. So the internet traffic light is kind of a mechanism that I've used with students to have some discussions about some different tough scenarios. So this model that I have, you certainly could make a copy of this, do your own version. I adopted it from Common Sense Media. But what I think is fun about this is that you're kind of leveling it to where your students are at, and then it's kind of a mechanism for having some conversations. But instead of just kind of like, oh, let's talk about, internet safety, like what if you were in a chat room and somebody said something inappropriate? A lot of students wouldn't want to chime right up, or it might be some of the usual suspects. So this is a nice way to bring people into the conversation, or kind of get the conversation started. So I'm gonna need you guys to, and I can copy and paste that link in there into the chat. But if you go to nearpod.com, you're gonna need to enter that 5-number code HTDNJ, and it is not case sensitive, I don't believe.
Okay, I'll let you go, and I'll talk to you Friday.
Do you think you can maybe put the link in the chat so that it's easy to copy?
Yep, I'm gonna do that right now. If I can find that page again. So Nearpod, what this does that I think is really awesome is that it allows you to push directly to a student's screen, which can be very helpful. All right, so there's the link. And then if you are just going to the page, that's the code that you can enter in there. All right, and I'm gonna take over the screen. So you guys can see. So you can see our numbers are growing. I believe you can have up to 100 students. So thankfully this session, we did not have 100 people register, did not have more sign up. So we should be able to do this without any problem. So when you first get on, I believe it's gonna prompt you for your name. I'm not gonna be a big stickler for names right now, but with students, you might want to be. So you can see that the code's in the upper left-hand side. So I'm gonna move forward and people can join as needed. We'll run through kind of a few of these prompts on here. So on your end, you should see the prompt that I have up on my screen, just so you know. So I'm showing you what the teacher end looks like, but on your screen, you would be seeing what the students would be seeing. You could project your screen if you wanted to, but you don't have to. So that's why this works really nicely for remote learning. So Hayden's story. Hayden has been playing End Times, an MMORPG about a zombie apocalypse for the past few months. He uses the avatar Buzzsaw and has made friends with a few other avatars. One of them, Neon Savage 97, was really nice to him when he first started. Once he learned how to play the game, he started teaming up with Neon Savage 97 on different missions. One day, one of their teammates asked how old Hayden was. Neon Savage 97 said, "No one cares, bro. Just play the game." So, oh, I totally forgot about explaining with the lights. So that's important. So the lights are red if you think this is a dangerous situation and you should just remove yourself from that situation immediately. Let an adult know. Again, you're imagining yourself as students. The yellow light is if you think this isn't a completely dangerous situation, but maybe I want to be kind of careful. Green is this situation is not unsafe at all. I was so nervous people were going to have issues getting on. I didn't even think about rolling out the prompt. So on the teacher end, what I can see are the percentages. So for those of you, if you click back to Zoom, you can kind of see what it looks like on the teacher end. So I can see how people are answering and which they are selecting on here. So then this lets me look at the results and kind of in real time move the conversation forward. So I can say, well, it looks like more than half of you thinks that this is a yellow light situation, that it's not so dangerous that you need to go tell an adult or be, you know, very concerned, but you might want to just be kind of aware of what's going on. All right, moving on to our next prompt. Riley's story. Riley has been going to chat rooms recently where kids around the same age can talk about their problems at school. One of the other people, CJ Cool 678, always has great suggestions for how to deal with problems that Riley has at school. When Riley is saying that their principal is really strict and does not allow gum, CJ Cool 678 says, "My school isn't that bad," and asks, "What's the name of your school?" So I'll have you guys pick a light. So again, red is dangerous, yellow is proceed with caution, and green is it's probably an okay situation. So on my end, I can see that, oh, it just bumped up. I'm gonna say more than half of people had not voted yet, but now it's shifted. So about 1/3 of you saying red, this is a dangerous situation. Riley should remove himself from the situation. So with students, what's nice about this, if I was projecting it, obviously you can see how people are voting. So you might not want that, but you can obviously on the teacher end, you could see, oh, I can see that so-and-so hasn't done anything yet. And if you're walking around a physical space, that can be a nice prompt. The other thing is that this allows you to kind of guide the conversations. So, okay, well, I see that, 12% of you said this is green. Maybe you could explain if somebody wants to speak up and thinks that this is a green situation, that this is completely safe, maybe you could kind of justify your thinking or explain your reasoning. So I think this is a really great mechanism for facilitating class discussion in a topic where, I mean, I think these kind of issues that I was just addressing are kind of challenging sometimes to have discussions with. I've mainly used this with 5th through 8th grade. So I don't know, maybe you wouldn't need as much prodding at different age levels. All right, we'll do one last one. Avery has gone over to Dakota's house to work on a project for Valentine's Day. And while looking up the word heart in an image search, they came across some pictures that Avery was not expecting. These were more than pictures from the body book in the library. It makes Avery feel uncomfortable, but Dakota says, it's not a big deal. Let's check them out. So in this scenario, what do you think? So this one, I like this prompt because I think this is a very common type of situation that students, like elementary students, middle school students would experience. So it's interesting to have conversations with them around, you know, how would Avery feel? And you wouldn't want to hurt your friend's feelings, or you wouldn't, you know, would you just like get up and leave? So it really, this one in particular, I think spurred a lot of interesting chat. So I can see that more than half of you said that is a red situation, that Avery needs to exit the premises. And I have, all right, I'm not gonna go on just because I think we've got to get moving on to other pieces, but I hope that some of you found that this was kind of a useful tool. So Nearpod, so obviously what I like about this is we're actually using it in a virtual setting. So hopefully some of you kind of got a sense of how that worked, or maybe didn't work, or could work for your students, or maybe not work. I think there's a lot of possibilities out there. The other suggestion I would have with the way that I've used Nearpod that I really liked is if you're looking at images, it can be much easier to just push that out directly to students. So they have the images right on their screen. They can blow it up big, as opposed to, you know, even if it's on a projector in a classroom or whatever. That's always a challenge I've found. All right, I'm going to turn things over to Emma now for the second half.
I can tell you were trying to hurry up faster there at the end. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about integrating these competencies in a remote environment. And kind of to address the question of why you might integrate, I really liked the answer that Transforming Education put out. And they kind of have spoken to that idea that by integrating this, you're, you know, weaving it into the fabric of the school day, and then you can hone in on existing skills and help them to develop it in a broader context. And that's just me paraphrasing that quote there. So feel free to read their exact terminology. So Transform Ed has a really great resource for integrating. This is an approach that they have found effective. It's research-based. This image is hyperlinked. So when you get this slide deck, if you want to dig in deeper to each of these components, you certainly can. We're going to go over each one kind of briefly and talk a little bit about how this looks in remote learning. And I have to get Zoom out of the way. Sorry, I only have one screen today. Okay, so starting with conducive environments, and thinking about this in a remote environment, then you want to create an inviting and student-centered virtual space. In remote learning, the student-centered piece, I think, is critical to the virtual space, because unless you're connecting synchronously, then it's kind of all about that user experience that they're going to have. Provide actionable feedback and celebrating progress. So find those moments where you can kind of celebrate success and provide feedback that's going to allow them to get to that point of success. And design assignments that are celebrating diversity of student abilities, perspectives, cultural backgrounds. So designing assignments that have as many opportunities for variation as possible, kind of allow that student-centered focused approach to take over and kind of give them a lot more choice in their options, which that is something we'll be talking a little bit more about tomorrow, is the idea of leveraging student voice and choice in remote learning. So if you want to talk a little bit more about that, feel free to join us for that. And then building emotional awareness and regulation practices into norms and setting them as a class priority. So not just kind of talking about these separately, but also emphasizing that, no, this is a priority for us as a class, that we're going to focus on, you know, these competencies and these items, you know, depending on the age and developmental levels of your learners, you could talk about them directly and what the competencies actually are, or you could kind of just reference to them indirectly in some of the more general ways. John, I think, gave some really great examples of how that can be done, kind of just infer to a certain idea. Moving on to strong relationships, making regular positive communication the norm, emphasizing that good. I think it's really easy to take negative feedback really negatively when you're in an isolated environment. So that positive communication is really, really important. You might feel like you're, you know, going over the top with being positive and bubbly or friendly, but it really goes a long way in a remote environment. So kind of making that the norm will enhance the communication experience for both you and the student, as well as it might also make the student feel more comfortable when they do have to come to you with a negative communication piece. Integrating activities that are allowing students to continuously build relationships between each other. These don't necessarily need to be synchronous activities. They could be group projects that they work on kind of on their own and then come together here and there to put things together. So it could certainly be done in a variety of ways in a remote environment, but focusing on that integration of those strong relationships into the stuff that they're doing to learn. And Julia mentioned this in the chat, using that restorative model to resolve conflict and promote empathy and understanding. You want to kind of come from that place. I referred to it last week as the compliment sandwich, you know, kind of focus on the good to help resolve the bad. You know, don't focus on the bad and how bad the bad was, but use what's good to kind of resolve the bad. And then including and celebrating various cultural and racial backgrounds in learning experiences. So this doesn't necessarily mean that you need to focus on each culture that is represented in your classroom. It means that you should be trying to include a wide variety of cultures in their learning experience. So an example of this could be holidays. You know, maybe your class is going to celebrate all holidays that year and kind of learn about the different cultural traditions that go along with each of the different holidays. And so there's all sorts of ways that you can bring those things into the learning experiences, but that will help your students to feel more involved, and it will develop that culture piece that comes within a virtual classroom. Explicit instruction. So using evidence-based high quality models and frameworks when designing and delivering instruction will set you off on the right foot to begin with. And then in designing instructions that are adaptable for learner needs, whether that's language needs, accessibility needs, cultural contexts, and emphasizing that student interest piece, that intrinsic motivation, that thing that's going to get them to come back and want to learn more. You know, what is it that they're interested in learning more about, and how can you build that into what they actually need to learn if it's not directly related? And creating student-centered instructions. So this might seem kind of like an odd thought, or it might be something that you're doing every day. It depends on your instruction style, but kind of putting yourself in that frame of the student and kind of thinking about what they might need to bring in those moments when they're reading the instructions, points of clarity, resources that might help them understand concepts, and just making sure that you're meeting them where they're at with your instructions, that you're not expecting them to kind of understand what your instructions are. It's that idea of being really super, super clear anytime that you're providing instructions. And then engaging students in discussion around the specific SEL competencies that apply to their lives and how they apply and how they'll make use of them moving forward. Again, this is very much grade and age level specific as to how technical you might get with your students, but it's safe to say that you could have really very competency focused conversations with middle and high school students, and then keep them a little bit more general the earlier you get in the learning experience. But just kind of keeping that in mind, that you want to have a discussion about how those things apply to their lives and how it will make their lives better. There's all sorts of research, but that's not going to speak to a student in the same way that, you know, you can kind of talk with them about their emotions or how they're handling themselves or their relationships with other people, and how if they're working on these competencies, that all of those things will improve. Thoughtful modeling. I think this is something that we've talked about in a lot of different contexts, but when you're actually modeling social emotional learning and the different competencies that are involved, make sure to be purposeful and use modeling to emphasize the student role. So you really want to make sure that students understand that they are, I guess a better way to say that would be to have students kind of play out the different roles that they would experience. So I think group discussions are a really great way to do that, because you can shift up the roles that people would have, and kind of you can work them through mock discussions and role playing and things of that nature, peer modeling, so that they're engaging in these conversations where they're experiencing more than just what they would normally do in a regular situation. So it kind of gives them multiple perspectives throughout the process. And then using modeling to emphasize constructive behaviors, so respect, appreciation, inclusivity. I like to suggest the idea of being really vocal when you are modeling something that is more internal. So if you're being appreciative of something, but it's not like in thank yous, you're just kind of more thankful for something internally, then you might want to like verbalize that with your students. Like, I'm really appreciative of this fact, or I'm really glad that this is here, or I have a lot of respect for this because, and then you're kind of verbalizing that intrinsic process that you have to model these competencies as well. And practice opportunities. So looking for places where you can reinforce these things, the concepts that we've talked about. Where can these things provide opportunity for students to practice what they are learning and what they're encountering in their daily activities? So that involves considering what activities are going to be most relevant to your students, as well as which competencies you're focusing on. So it can be really overwhelming to try to think, I'm going to tackle all 5 of these competencies in this lesson. So maybe you'll think, okay, with this activity, I would like to address, you know, the self-awareness piece. And so I'm going to make sure that this activity addresses that, because that's relevant to my students for this reason. And then having that sort of rationale before you just dive into creating a practice opportunity. And then planning ahead to integrate opportunities within things that you're already doing. So maybe look at some activities that you have planned or things you'd like to do, and look for ways to just emphasize these competencies. I think that a lot of these strategies end up mirroring some of the recommendations that we've made for digital citizenship, because I think that social emotional learning and digital citizenship are kind of very similar in the way that they're most effective when they're integrated into things that are already happening. So when you're looking for ways to incorporate SEL or digital citizenship, then you would want to look for things that you're already doing that kind of have those bits and pieces, and then just emphasize that with your students. Like, you know, oh, look at what we're doing here. We just made a responsible decision, and we did that going through this process, you know, and letting them kind of see that in real time, that that's what they just did, can be really helpful. And then creating practice opportunities that are responsive to the differentiated needs of your students. This can be a little bit more challenging, but an asynchronous virtual environment actually can play really well to this, because you can differentiate what learners need to focus on based on kind of what you've gathered, either through formative assessment or however you've assessed them. And then teachable moments, looking for teachable moments. I think this is something that probably most of us are the most comfortable with. And that's that idea of during conversations and learning, kind of look for those moments to maybe pause for a moment, call out something that students have done that was constructive, avoid calling students out for negative things that will never go well, but kind of focusing on that constructive feedback, you know, reinforcing things and generalizing, reinforcing the generalization and I'm trying to speak too fast. Reinforcing the generalization and transfer of social emotional learning that has been taught, kind of looking for those ways that you taught this, and now we're talking about it in a more general way, and this is the part of reinforcement that can be most effective. And then acknowledging moments of not only celebration, but also missed opportunities. So how could a moment have gone better if a certain competency was considered, or if something was handled differently? Kind of that moment of reflection can be super helpful for students in understanding how they might have handled something differently. So we're gonna open things up for questions in a few minutes, but there are a few resources here that we wanted to share. The top one is the quick reference guide that has those 6 things to keep in mind when you're integrating SEL. And then the next one down is specifically speaking to integrating social emotional learning within virtual learning. And I think that those are really helpful for framing that integration piece. And then we've also included the Castle resource and some DOE resources that are posted on the page we have social emotional behavior specialists, and they've been posting quite a bit of things.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, so Kelly Bailey actually was a huge get for the DOE to get her to come and work for us. So she hasn't been there a really long time, but she's been doing a lot of great stuff and pulling together some great resources. So we want to definitely include that. And the last 3 in there are resources that I think she had recommended, and they have some availability now, I think, because of some of the paywalls and stuff coming down because of the COVID-19 situation. So if you're interested, this might be the time to go in and like check some of those things out while they're free. I don't know when the paywalls might come back up, but it might be an opportunity for people to investigate some of those.
Awesome. And then again, just in case this is your first time, we will be sending out these slide decks via email to anyone who registered for the session. We've had some questions about watching videos. If you didn't register for the session, kind of watching them after the fact and getting access to the slides. We are going to be updating the YouTube descriptions on the DOE page to include the link to the slide decks as well, but we haven't been able to do that yet. So that is something that will be coming down the line, and we'll be sending an email out to anyone who has reached out in regards to that once we have that done. But just so that you know, that is coming, and you will get an email with this slide deck before that. So you don't have to worry about trying to write down the links or anything like that. So just our traditional checklist before we get into questions really quickly. Being certain to set goals for SEL, which competencies are most important to your class at that time. Being familiar with each of the competencies, making sure that you're incorporating activities that are promoting them, considering ways to integrate them, and promoting conscious consideration of them, both among your class as well as within activities and lessons. And then having discussion about the competencies with students and focusing on making the connections that they'll make real to life when you're discussing those. So just a few things to keep in mind when you're kind of thinking a little bit more generally about social emotional learning in a remote environment. And so now we can open things up for questions if anyone has any questions, and I can check out the chat, which I haven't had a chance to do at all. You can feel free to unmute yourself if you have any thoughts or questions. Oh, that's funny. I answered the only question in the chat and I hadn't even seen the chat.
I thought you had seen the chat.
I don't know. I didn't. I guess I psychically picked up on it.
Well done.
I think everyone's feeling like that little girl. Just not
I got a
really-
question.
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just wondering with the social emotional, I'm gonna hook up with another meeting with that. Do you know if the state is planning to like train like professionals to go to our schools to tell us how to do all this stuff? Because I'm a math teacher and dealing with social emotional stuff. I mean, I've been teaching for 25 years, so I know how to model all that stuff. But during this pandemic, I'm just wondering if the state, if you know, planning to send you guys to the schools to help us out and how to model that more in these times.
Well, I'm not sure what, like Kelly and the team that she's on, I'm not sure what professional development stuff that they have lined up. I mean, it's very typical for people within the department to have trainings happen over the summer. Obviously, some of those have, you know, changed and shifted and stuff like that. So off the top of my head, I'm not sure what PD that she's been involved with. We did link in there, I know recordings that she did. Emma and I we're not like social emotional specialists. This was just, it seemed like a really important topic to be bringing in within the framework of remote learning. So I think that's kind of how we were framing this and trying to get some resources and get people kind of keeping that piece in there and kind of being aware of that. But certainly there are people at the department that have kind of more expertise around that. And obviously the past 3 months have informed and changed a lot of the ways that people have both gone presenting that information, but also the needs for students out there has changed. So I think that's a consideration as well.
All right, thank you, Joe.
Yep.
John, sorry.
No problem.
I'm over here in Colorado, so I'm like behind the times, like 2 hours. So appreciate your time, folks. I really like all those resources that you sent me.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Any other questions or thoughts that anyone wants to share? Gordon wrote in the chat that it's a really big topic, and he's definitely very correct. Each piece you could dive into for a long, long time.
Is tomorrow?
John,
Oh, whoops, sorry.
Go ahead.
Thank you for the session. It was great. And I want to thank Julia Edwards for letting some of us know about it. And just wondering if tomorrow's at 1 as well instead of 11, or?
Tomorrow and Thursday are both at 11. Today was the only day that we had to shift the time to 1 p.m.
Thank you.
Yep.
Oh, and somebody had asked about the mayor's windows sliding glass doors. I forget where that comes from. But it's, I mean, common for a common mechanism that librarians use, in that when you're presenting books to students, the mirrors part is that seeing themselves in the books that they're looking at or are reading. The windows is obviously looking out to the world, and then the sliding glass doors is the idea that they could go out and be in that other world. So it's kind of those 3 tiers when you're presenting different books to students.
All right, well, I'll toss it out there for another quick second to see if anyone else has any more questions, but I'm not going to hold everybody here till 2 p.m. on the dot if there are no other questions.
Do you guys have a link for contact hours for this session?
Oh my gosh, did we skip that part?
Hey, we totally did. You're right.
We do have a link.
We do. One moment.
We'll pull it up so there
Oh
you
my
can.
goodness. Thank you so much for asking that.
I will drop that in chat, and then
I've got the
those
screen shared as well.
watching the video in the future. Oops.
I feel like it's kind of worth mentioning for the people, if we've done a few of these before and are planning on doing more, that you guys have used the same bit.ly link. So we just go in and change. You can bookmark it.
Yep. Self-serve.
Yep, yeah, you just pick whichever session you actually attended and or watched the recording of, and then it'll give you the corresponding certificate, which I think has been working for most people. All right, well, everybody have an absolutely lovely afternoon. Enjoy the sunshine. Don't
Well,
get
I
burned.
have one more question and also a comment.
Absolutely.
All right. First of all, my comment. These crickets moments. That's how it felt while doing the virtual classroom, because what we had as a norm for our school was students mute themselves, teachers lecture, and that's not my style. That's totally not my style. So actually, I had to ask my students to unmute themselves because I needed the noise of my students, because that's how my classes are. And this, I think the norm of mute versus unmute is a good norm for lecture. But if you're not doing lecture and you're actually doing discussion, having mute mics, there's no discussion. So that was something that I wanted to point. Now, my question regarding the getting CEUs while watching the, I just find out about these sessions. I wish I would find out sooner. But being able to get CEUs, if we watch the video, how can we go about getting the CEUs for the videos?
So that link that we just shared out, that John dropped in the chat, that link has an option in it. It's a form, and in it has the option to choose which session you watched. And then you just answer the question if you attended live or if you watched the recording, and it will give you your certificate.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep.
Absolutely.
So, and we didn't do these necessarily in an order. So don't feel like if you want to go back and watch the one about norms that we talked about, because we kind of touched upon some of that today, by all means, go back and watch that video and get your CEUs for that.
Yes, there's definitely like a progression, but they are also standalone. So if there's something that you just want to dig a little bit deeper into, you could just watch that one for sure. All right, everyone, have a lovely afternoon.
Yes. Bye.
Bye.